Released in 2020, Riot Games Valorant has seen massive success across live streaming platforms and on the international esports stage, with a seven-figure purse up for grabs at only its second international championship and peak viewership of over 1.5 million spectators. A combination of time-worn tactical shooter game mechanics and unique, colorful character designs, Valorant has joined Riot Games' wildly successful League of Legends as one of the top video games of recent years. It's not the only first-person shooter on the market right now, but it's definitely on its way to becoming the most popular, with both concurrent player counts and Twitch viewership dominating those of other FPS powerhouses with their own internationally competitive esports scenes. A stark contrast to the gritty realism of Counter-Strike and Call of Duty games, two franchises that dominated FPS markets for most of the 21st century, many are left wondering why Riot decided to abandon traditional military vernacular, attire, and settings for the almost childish graphics that form the Valorant battlefield. When CSGO had been a cornerstone of the market since its early 2010s release, why stray from its blueprint of masculine, desaturated graphics and incorporate fantasy characters who can fly through the sky, especially when games like Overwatch already exist? To answer this question, and in an attempt to explore what makes Riot Games Valorant different, and therefore more successful than traditional FPS games, let's first take a look at their history within the industry. First-person shooter games, video games in which the player controls a weapon, typically a gun, and navigates some kind of combat from a first-person perspective, have been major players of the video game industry for decades, with Wolfenstein 3D 1992 release typically seen as the genre's beginning. An instant success, Wolfenstein involved its player character breaking out of a Nazi German prison and carrying out missions against soldiers, dogs, and bosses, including Hitler in a robotic suit. The game was said to have set a, quote, new standard for PC gaming upon its release, unsurprising considering its $2.5 million revenue and 250,000 copies sold by 1995. Released only a week later, ID Software's Doom refined what Wolfenstein had introduced to the video game market, with higher quality textures and more complex level design. Considered by many to be the most important shooting game ever made, shown by its porting to virtually every console system on the market, Doom paved the way for a flood of other FPS titles in the late 90s, including games like Quake, which was also a product of ID Software, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, and Half-Life. But when the FPS games would reach their most successful came hand in hand with the post-9/11 war on terror sentiment, when developers noticed that jingoistic tendencies in the American population could be exploited on the online battlefield. One sponsor in particular, the U.S. Army, would go on to fund one of the most important games of the 2000s, America's Army, a military recruitment and trading tool disguised as a shooting video game. Self-proclaimed as a propaganda device, the game has seen more than 13 million registered users since its release and includes gameplay that teaches users to operate a Humvee, shoot grenade launchers, and control missiles. Realism was integral to America's Army both as a recruiting tool and a game mechanic, a sentiment that would be seen in many more successful games to follow, such as Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare, and Halo 2, both of which included the US military's vernacular, graphics, and value system incorporated into gameplay. As war and terror sentiment diminished, this emphasis would eventually die down, resulting in more fantastical scenarios taking place on the screen, but the popularity that early FPS games established would remain. When the contemporary gamer thinks about FPS games, odds are a few different titles come to mind. Counter-Strike, Global Offensive, or CSGO, for example, is perhaps one of the most successful titles of the 21st century, with 1.4 million concurrent players reported in March 2023, 11 years after the game's 2012 release. But you can't talk about FPS games without looking at games like those of the Call of Duty and Halo franchises, which dominated discussion about video games and violence for a mass majority of 2010's media cycles. But then there's also Overwatch, another team-based FPS game released in 2016 by Blizzard Entertainment. A more fantastic take on CSGO's gritty realism, the 2010 esports scene was led by these two titles, with Overwatch players flocking to the game's extensive roster of characters with diverse backgrounds and abilities. With over $1 billion in reported revenue and more than 50 million players reported in 2019, Overwatch shows that FPS games don't need to be masculine and desaturated to be successful. There are too many FPS games for me to list them all, and that's not really what this video is about. We're here to talk about Valorant, and why it's different. Overwatch and CSGO might be two sides of the FPS graphics coin, but what if they had something in common? Something going back to the history of the genre outlined previously that Valorant lacks. From the moment you load into CSGO, it's clear that you're playing a product of the United States military-industrial complex, be it through the clear demarcation of terrorists, accented men who plant bombs as non-American, and the counter-terrorists, those defusing the bombs or killing the terrorists, as clearly American in voice lines, weapons, and clothing.
Break time's over, ladies. Let's go.
Or the tutorial, which uses military terminology and situates the player in a faux military training ground.
Way to hit the giant wood target. You just saved democracy.
There's no question as to who the game is created for and why. In development, realism, both graphically and mechanically, is stressed, with certain weapons dealing damage differently depending on their situations and accuracy. Though it is still a video game with plenty of unrealistic aspects to it, CSGO's premise, graphics, gameplay, and even marketing all reflect the influence of the United States military complex that funded the growth of FPS games in the early 2010s, something that has not gone unnoticed by Army recruiters themselves. Quote, "If we are going to be successful in recruiting, then we need to be where young people are. And they are operating in the digital world," said Major General Frank Muth, commanding general for U.S. Army Recruiting Command in a 2018 release. The same year that the U.S. Air Force announced a partnership with the Cloud9 CSGO team, the winners of the 2018 Boston Major. But if CSGO's realism is the problem, then why is Overwatch, a game that features talking animals, teleportation, and resurrection, lumped in alongside it? Though Activision Blizzard is no stranger to U.S. military sponsorships themselves, the Army's role in Overwatch gameplay can actually be seen in its lore. According to the Overwatch Wikipedia's page on the United States Army, which is a real thing, the U.S. military is a canonical entity in the world of Overwatch lore, with depictions in graphic novels, cinematic videos, short stories, novellas, and more. Known for its in-universe, quote, soldier enhancement program, American characters such as Soldier 76 and Reaper, and various battlegrounds set in American locations, Overwatch is riddled with references to the real-life military that funds a competitive Overwatch team and uses the game as a recruitment tool. But Overwatch's conflict isn't even limited to nods to American military conquest. The entire lore is based upon geopolitical crises, with Overwatch, a United Nations-based strike team comprised of heroes from across the globe. Of course, it is led by Americans. The game might be far more colorful and quirky than CSGO, but it's still undeniably and intrinsically linked to military endeavors. Valorant is different. Though at first glance it might appear to be a combination of the two games, a team-based bomb-defusing game with colorful graphics and agents from across the globe, there is no commitment to realism in the game's weapon mechanics or any kind of reference to the US military at all. Above all, Riot Games' product is entirely separate from any existing military conflict, with real-world locations used only as backdrops for the game's imagined conflict. And, at least as of the time of making this video, Riot has yet to enter into any sponsorship deals with the military themselves. The guns in Valorant are the Vandal or the Sheriff, rather than CSGO's AK-47 or Glock 18. Countries exist only to give locations and accents to characters, rather than as political entities fighting in a global war. And the people planting the bombs are no different than the people defusing them, with sides labeled only as offense and defense, and no difference in the opposing side's appearances or abilities. No FPS game can truly be separated from the US military's heavy-handed involvement, but Valorant does what Overwatch and CSGO didn't in establishing a premise and mechanics separate from what exists in the real world. Agents may be indicated as American, but their allegiance is not to America, and the Valorant team is not a stand-in for the United Nations. The game's conflict is between two ideologically opposed organizations fighting across multiple dimensions. The game is void of any kind of military representations or affiliations, not just American ones. This divorce from the ideals and foundations of the FPS genre can be for a number of reasons, though Riot Games has never explicitly stated why they made this choice. One explanation can come from the simple passage of time. Now, 2 decades after 9/11, the War on Terror is generally regarded to have come to a close, particularly due to the 2021 withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. This video essay is anything but a sociopolitical analysis of terrorism's role in domestic politics, but the modern political climate no longer resembles that of the post-9/11 years. The sentiment that drove so many gamers to fight for their country on the online battlefield has diminished, and as such, developers have turned their attention to elsewhere, to conflicts that will stand the test of time. Another reason for Valorant's departure from military conflict and ideology can be explained via the globalization of esports and the specific role that FPS games play in international competition. Riot Games is no stranger to what makes a successful international esport. League of Legends, another one of their products, has seen multi-million-dollar success and viewership eclipsing mainstream sports championships. And so it follows that after seeing the global impact their games can have, they would want to create a game separated from one particular nation's traditions and ideas. With massive audiences in Southeast Asia, South America, and Europe, a game that enforces American military ideology might run into the same sort of problems that CSGO saw via its depictions of terrorists once the game hit the international stage. Or perhaps this separation comes from a growing discourse in whether or not video games cause violence, a debate heightened by the obvious interference the military has in funding FPS games and events. A topic for another time, the correlation between gun games' popularity and a rise in mass shootings is a hot topic every time a tragedy occurs. Divorcing a game's military vocabulary and realism, incorporating fantastical mechanics to make the game seem less like a a shooting simulator and more like a team-based strategy game could be a direct response to these worries. We can only guess why Riot made the choice they did to establish Valorant as a game separate from the US military, but the benefits are clear. So far, the game has yet to generate any of the controversy seen by its predecessors, and the esports is growing rapidly, with its international champions tour boasting hundreds of thousands of viewers and fans despite the game's young age. The international scene in particular is of note. Contention for international titles is no longer limited to the usual Western and Southeast Asian players, with Brazil, for example, demonstrating a considerable presence on the VCT stage. Whether or not this was a conscious choice by Riot Games developers, the departure its first-person shooter game demonstrates from traditional United States-centric military conflict has contributed in some part to its massive international success. Though shooter games will always be shooter games regardless of who is funding them, at the very least, Valorant's demilitarization can provide future titles with incentive to separate their characters, weapons, and lore from the complex that has been intrinsic to the genre since the very beginning.